Hello, welcome to today's live stream. So it's again Sunday, 2 p.m. Here we go again. So today we're going to be having a look at an English language structure question. Do excuse me today, I do have a little bit of a cold. It is flu season, so I might be blowing my nose a little bit through this, but we will get through it. So if you're watching on YouTube, thank you for joining me. Today, for the YouTube video, what we're going to do is just go through some elements of structure, what I like to call the four key elements, the things that we'll be looking out for when we read a text, and then that's where the video will end. The whole video, though, which is on Patreon and which will be on Patreon once it's recorded, will then go and look at those elements within a text. So we're going to read an extract from The Wind in the Willows, and we're going to hopefully look to answer a GCSE style question as we go as well. So first things first, we are going to have a look at those structural elements. So get a notebook handy and get ready to take some notes. Again, if you are on YouTube, please like, comment and subscribe, and also have a look at joining my Patreon. The link will be in the description below. To join that is just $5 a month, which is just under £4, and that gives you access to all of these live streams, which you can rewatch whenever you want because they will also be uploaded. Also exclusive worksheets and things like that. So brilliant resources, and it's very affordable, I believe, for the whole month. So let's have a look at the first thing I'm going to do. So in your notebooks, we're just going to have a little title today. Structure. So I think it's a good practice to keep the date as you write notes. Then you can keep track of when you've done what, and it helps you keep track of progress and things that you've learned. So let's think about what structure actually means. Structure is basically how a piece of writing is put together. So it's basically the building blocks of that writing. When we've looked at language before, what we're looking at is particular word choices or figurative techniques. But structure is a bit wider than that. It's a bit broader, and it's looking at the essential building blocks, not necessarily the nitty-gritty of the language itself. So things that we are going to be looking at is writers' focus, how they zoom in and zoom out of particular elements. And it's basically the building blocks. So the four key things that I like to think of when we're talking about structure are narrative perspective. I will go into more detail for these as we go. Character, time, and setting. Okay, so the first one, narrative perspective. In the most simple terms, narrative perspective is what sort of voice is being used in a text. But in the simplest way, we're thinking, is it either first person, first of all, or third person? Now, that's the key difference. You very rarely see second person in a piece of fiction. It's quite difficult to maintain in a piece of fiction, second person. Second person is when you use the second pronoun you, so when you're talking directly to the reader. And it's not something, I'm just going to open the window because it's another wall in it. It's not something we generally tend to use when we are writing a piece of creative writing. First person is when you're talking about I, me, my. Obviously, that doesn't actually have to be you or the writer itself. It's a character you create, a persona you create. And third person is talking about he, she, they, so another character. So often third person is an omniscient narrator. Omniscient means, I'll just write this down. So third person could be omniscient, which means all-knowing. So it's almost like a godlike figure talking about the characters. And that creates a different perspective than someone who's actually in the story themselves, so a character themselves. A third person could be a character within the narrative. What that does, though, is it could create more of an unreliable narrator, which we talk about sometimes, which might mean that a character has their own agendas and ideas, and therefore we can't necessarily trust everything they say to be true for that story or that setting. Third person can also feel a little bit like first person, so that's when we have a close third, basically. We'll call it a close third person for today. There are different words for it. So we still follow one character, or we might move from one character to another, but we're still following a character through the story. Again, that changes how we read it a little bit, because we're seeing it from that character's perspective. Obviously, with first person, we're always doing that. It's probably more emotional, more biased, because we're always within that character's head, and probably helps a little bit with characterization, building character. Telling me that's spelled wrong because they think we're in America and we're not. So yeah, there's lots of different perspectives you can take. But essentially, when we look at narrative perspective, we want to look at what it is for the particular text we're looking at. So first of all, the first question, is it first or third person? And then you go into more detail. So if it's first person, who is it? What are they like? What is their perspective going to change about the way we read the text? And obviously, a writer can change the perspective as the story progresses. So it may not stick with one perspective, it may shift and change as we go. And we think about why the writer does this. Today, what we really are going to be looking at, and what's a key element of structure really, is narrative shifts or turning points. So when a writer changes their perspective on what they're writing, why have they done that? That's what we're thinking about. Why have they done that? Now, today, when we actually get into answering a question for those on Patreon, we're going to be using the question structure that you might have in a very popular exam board, and it's always written the same regardless of the text. So it will be how, whatever the text may be, how has the writer structured the text to interest you as a reader? Now, it's important not to necessarily get caught up in this you element, because you might be thinking about a reader in general. So even if it doesn't interest you, why might it interest someone? So we're thinking about what the writer has done to keep our interest. And that often relates to these narrative shifts or turning points, because although a choice a writer makes may be interesting, if you continue with that same choice for too long, so you stick with one perspective and you're in one scene for too long, the reader's interest might wane. So it's when you shift to a new scene, a new event, a new person, that's what's going to keep the reader's interest. So that's the sort of thing we're going to be looking for, how it shifts from one thing to the other within these four elements. So character is very similar to narrative perspective, but obviously this includes all of the characters who aren't our eyes as well. So character just relates to this idea of characterization. And that doesn't necessarily have to be a human character. It could be an animal or sometimes even a building, although that links to setting as well. It can have character of its own. So things that we associate with that particular construct that the writer has made. Remember, all characters are constructs. They're just tools that the writer is using to create an effect for us. How has it been built? So if we are thinking about a human character, what are their personality traits and how do we know? What are the things they do that make them who they are? And therefore, what questions does the reader have about that character? And why is that interesting? That's the key thing. So who are they? Why is this interesting? Well, how do we know, first of all? We want to think about how has the writer actually built that character and why is this interesting? Okay. And then we move on to time. Now, time can sometimes get a bit confusing for people. We might think, oh, is this talking about the time period? No, not necessarily. That's where setting comes into play in a minute. Time is talking about either pacing or order of events. So it's when events in the story happen, and also how quickly they happen. Does it slow down? Does it get faster? And why? Okay. So in terms of the order of events, it could be chronological, okay? Chronological meaning that it happens in order that it actually might have happened in real life. So the start is at the start and the end is at the end. What can be a little bit more interesting, though, is if we have things like flashbacks, where we look at what's happened in the past before we move to the future, or similarly, flash forwards, where we have a little glimpse of what's to come before we come back and show the reader how we got there. What's also really popular is something called a cyclical structure, where we come back to the beginning almost at the end. Not necessarily the same scene, but a version of that beginning. And that can be a nice, neat way of wrapping up a story. Pacing, then, is all about tension. How do we build it? When do we need it? Do we want things to be happening quickly? And if so, why? Or do we need to elongate something, sit with a description for a little bit? And it's always there's no wrong choice, but the choice will always affect how the reader receives the text. So we've got to think about, how is this changing the way we're reading it? Are we moving from one pace to another quite quickly? Or have we stayed at a slow pace for a really long time and then go to a quick pace? And what effect does that have? So how is this built, basically? How do we build tension? That's the key thing. And then the fourth one is setting. So setting, as I said before, could be the time period, but it's also obviously where we are. So setting is when and where. So what this affects is the atmosphere, or the tone, or the mood of a text. So where we are affects how we feel. When we are affects how we feel. So if we think a story based in 19th century London is going to be a very different story than a story that's based in the countryside in 2005. There are going to be different expectations we have of that setting, different things going on. The characters will behave differently within that context, because obviously what this affects is the context. Having a story within context affects our expectations, and therefore can allow the writer to perhaps subvert those expectations by giving us something that we wouldn't expect from that environment. Because if we're in space, we might expect to see a shooting star or an alien. But if we're not in space, we won't expect to see those things. So when we do see them, if we see them, we have a different reaction to them, and it might interest us for a different reason. Okay, so essentially, all of those elements are the things you're looking for with structure. And when you talk about them, you would talk about them in the same way as you would with language when you quote a technique. So with language, we might talk about a writer using a simile in order to show us this. Here, instead of that, when we're talking about structure, we might say that the writer uses pacing, okay, uses time through quick pacing in order to create this. So these kind of sit in place of our techniques or our methods. If you sort of imagine the structure we might be doing for language analysis, it's almost exactly the same. We just use different words and terminology to talk about the techniques for structure. What's also important with structure is you can quote if you want to reference parts of the text, but you don't need to, because of course we're not talking about the language, we're talking about the story as a whole, the narrative structure. So therefore we can just summarize what's going on instead of directly quoting, which can speed things up or it could slow things down depending on how you feel about quoting and finding evidence. But a crucial point is you don't need to quote the structure because we're not talking about the language. And sometimes I advise people not to, because otherwise they're tempted to then pick out words when that's not what we're doing for a structure question. Okay, so those are the key points. Just be aware of those when you're reading texts with structure in mind, and try and analyze those ideas, consider why a writer may have used them. What I might do before I finish this YouTube video is just move over to the text we're going to read together and just talk about one structural element before I then close the YouTube video off and continue with my Patreon video for everybody else. Again, if you are watching on YouTube and you want to watch this whole video, please feel free to join my Patreon in the link below. This video will have been uploaded onto there as well in full. Okay, so we are looking at an extract from Wind in the Willows today for our structure, the very first chapter, the riverbank. So let's read up to here. Okay, I'm going to consider what structural elements are being used here and how they're effective. Okay. So the mole had been working very hard all the morning, spring cleaning his little home, first with brooms, then with dusters, then on ladders and steps and chairs with a brush and a pail of whitewash, till he had dust in his throat and eyes and splashes of whitewash all over his black fur, and an aching back and weary arms. Okay. So there's a few things going on here. First of all, narrative perspective, we're in third person. So I feel like here the third person is inviting us into this world with them, because they feel like they're at a distance a little bit. We've not been given the mole's name yet, it's just the mole. So we feel quite distant from this character at the moment, but it's almost like we're coming in with the narrator to try and get closer to this character. Then we have this idea of character that's being built. So thinking about what sort of character this mole is, he's been working very hard all morning. Okay, so he's a hard worker. Spring cleaning his little home. So he's a humble creature. We know that. First with brooms, then with dusters, then on ladders and steps and chairs with a brush and a pail of whitewash till he had dust in his throat and eyes and splashes of whitewash all over his black fur and an aching back and weary arms. So he's hard worker to the point where he almost feels a little bit like a perfectionist. Yes, if we were talking about the creation of character here, we might say that the writer uses, excuse me, my cold. The writer describes the mole cleaning his home. He lists, now bear in mind the structure we can also talk about, and it might be worth listing this here actually. He lists implements and activities he's doing to clean his home. So you can also talk about grammatical / sentence structures in terms of the nitty gritty, if you wanted to. So he uses lists of implements and activities that he is doing to clean his home in order to show us that the character is a perfectionist and that he uses or is keen to get his home as clean as possible. This shows us that the mole is hardworking and, think of another word, shall we? Determined. This interests the reader because we wonder how he is going to be hardworking and determined within the plot of the story. What is he going to be working hard at as the story progresses, perhaps? That was just a quick idea. But notice that you don't necessarily have to just talk about one structural element within a paragraph. I mentioned grammatical structures. I could have mentioned the narrative perspective with that third person, and I could mention the character. So that's just a little glimpse into how we might approach it. Okay, I'm going to end the YouTube video now, so thank you very much for joining me. Again, please like, comment, and subscribe, and if you would like to join the Patreon to watch this full video, link is in the description below.